Burkina Faso is running out of time. For nearly a decade, jihadist groups linked to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have expanded across the country's northern and eastern regions, overwhelming local defenses and eroding state authority. Since 2015, more than 2 million people have been displaced. Entire provinces have slipped beyond effective government control, and the military has been forced into a permanent state of emergency. This is not a low-intensity conflict. It is a sustained war of attrition, and Burkina Faso is losing resources faster than it can replace them. In March 2025, Ibrahim Traoré made that reality explicit. Speaking in Ouagadougou, he declared that the country was fighting 2 wars at once. The first is the armed insurgency the world sees. The second, he argued, is economic and diplomatic pressure following Burkina Faso's decision to sever military ties with France and withdraw from security arrangements linked to Paris. After French troops were expelled in early 2023, military assistance slowed, intelligence cooperation weakened, and European Union counterterrorism funding declined sharply. Western governments deny this was punishment, describing it instead as a consequence of strained relations and Burkina Faso's growing alignment with Russia. But for Traoré's government, the distinction is irrelevant. The result is the same. A military already stretched thin is now expected to sustain an expanding counterinsurgency with fewer supplies, less intelligence, and shrinking external support. Every operation consumes ammunition that cannot be easily replaced. Every ambush increases demand for fuel, medical supplies, and air cover the country does not reliably possess. In this context, Burkina Faso's leadership faced a binary choice. Accept political conditions tied to Western security assistance, or seek alternatives that prioritize immediate survival over long-term approval. Traoré chose survival. That decision marks a turning point. Because when a state fighting an existential war loses access to its traditional partners, it does not retreat. It looks elsewhere. And in the Sahel, where power vacuums rarely stay empty, that search for alternatives reshapes the entire strategic landscape. Once Ibrahim Traoré decided that survival could not depend on Western approval, Burkina Faso's strategic posture shifted rapidly. The first response was internal. Recruitment surged, particularly through the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, a civilian militia designed to compensate for an overstretched army. This decision carried immediate consequences. In towns and villages already hollowed out by displacement, young men were armed and sent toward front lines they barely understood. For families, this was no abstract policy debate. It was the moment a son became a combatant. But internal mobilization alone could not solve the deeper problem. Burkina Faso's military was burning through ammunition, fuel, and equipment at a pace that far exceeded domestic capacity. Air reconnaissance missions increased. Ground operations pushed deeper into insurgent-held territory. Every gain required logistics the country could not reliably sustain. This is where external actors entered decisively. Russia arrived first, quietly and without ceremony. According to multiple reports, cargo aircraft delivered small arms, ammunition, and armored vehicles, accompanied by military trainers likely affiliated with private contractors operating outside traditional diplomatic frameworks. There were no public conditions attached, no demands for governance reform, no timelines imposed. From Ouagadougou's perspective, this was not ideology. It was practicality. Russia offered what was needed immediately, and in a war of attrition, immediacy matters. China's role followed a different pattern, but proved equally consequential. Rather than emphasizing overt militarization, Beijing focused on systems that enhanced state control and operational reach. Drones improved surveillance. Communications equipment reduced response times. Infrastructure projects, particularly road construction, transformed mobility across regions where terrain and distance had long favored insurgent groups. These roads were framed as development, but their military utility was unmistakable. Troops moved faster. Supply lines stabilized. Intelligence flowed more efficiently. The distinction between civilian infrastructure and military capability blurred by design. Together, Russian hardware and Chinese systems began to stabilize gaps left by Western withdrawal, but they did not fully resolve Burkina Faso's vulnerabilities. Air defense remained weak, sustained resupply was uncertain, and dependence on any single partner carried risks Traoré was unwilling to accept. His government framed its approach as diversification, not alignment, a deliberate effort to avoid replacing one form of dependence with another. But diversification in a conflict zone invites attention. Across the Sahel, other governments were watching closely. Mali had already embraced Moscow. Niger expelled French forces and opened channels to Russian trainers. Chad signaled frustration with traditional partnerships. Burkina Faso was no longer an outlier. It was becoming a case study. And then came the development that shifted the story from regional realignment to global alarm. According to reports emerging in late 2024, North Korea entered the picture with an offer unlike anything on the table. Not loans, not aid packages, but a direct exchange. Weapons, fuel, ammunition, and air defense systems in return for agricultural land and mineral access. No money, no banks, no exposure to the international financial system. For a country struggling to maintain supply chains under political pressure, the appeal was obvious. North Korea maintains a large domestic arms industry built to function outside global norms. Its equipment is older, less sophisticated, but reliable and compatible with irregular warfare. For Burkina Faso, fighting an insurgency with whatever works, this was not a philosophical question. It was a logistical one. But this offer carried implications far beyond the battlefield. If accepted, it would mark the first time a heavily sanctioned state used African land and resources at scale to bypass the global sanctions architecture entirely. It would signal that Western financial leverage could be neutralized through barter and long-term access agreements. And it would place Burkina Faso at the center of a parallel system forming quietly beyond Washington, Paris, and Brussels. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could find weapons. The question was what kind of world would emerge if this model succeeded. The moment reports surfaced that Burkina Faso was considering military support from North Korea, the reaction was immediate and deeply polarized. Inside the country, fear and resolve collided. For families already living under emergency conditions, the news did not feel ideological. It felt final. If Pyongyang was entering the picture, many understood that Burkina Faso had reached a point where conventional options were exhausted. In Ouagadougou, supporters of Ibrahim Traoré framed the move as proof that the government was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the nation. They pointed to years of Western-backed security operations that failed to stop jihadist expansion, arguing that moral lectures meant little when villages were still burning. Critics, however, saw something darker unfolding. They warned that trading land and mineral access for weapons risked locking the country into arrangements that future generations could not undo. Civil liberties had already been curtailed under the justification of national emergency. Media scrutiny tightened. Political dissent narrowed. What supporters called discipline, opponents described as authoritarian consolidation wrapped in the language of sovereignty. Internationally, anxiety spread faster than clarity. European officials expressed concern behind closed doors, not only about North Korea's involvement, but about what it symbolized. If a sanctioned state could embed itself militarily and economically in West Africa without consequence, the credibility of the global sanctions regime itself was at risk. France, already pushed out of Burkina Faso, found its influence reduced to statements and diplomatic signals that no longer carried weight on the ground. Washington watched carefully, aware that overt pressure could accelerate the very realignment it sought to avoid. Public condemnation risked driving Ouagadougou further into alternative partnerships. Silence, however, risked normalizing a dangerous precedent. Across the Sahel, leaders were taking notes. In Mali and Niger, where Western partnerships had also frayed, the Burkina Faso case reinforced a growing belief that security could be sourced without political conditions if one was willing to accept different costs. This is where the emotional center of the crisis hardened. For ordinary Burkinabe, the debate over geopolitics offered little comfort. Parents worried less about who supplied the weapons and more about whether the fighting would ever end. Farmers questioned what it meant when foreign governments gained access to land. Their families had worked for generations. Soldiers faced a different calculation. Better weapons increased survival in the short term, but extended conflicts demanded loyalty, not just to a flag, but to a future they could still believe in. Traoré's legitimacy increasingly rested on a single promise: that sovereignty, once secured, would eventually bring stability. Whether that promise was realistic or merely necessary became almost irrelevant. It had become the foundation of state authority. International analysts began framing Burkina Faso as a tipping point. If Traoré succeeded in suppressing insurgent momentum while bypassing Western systems, the appeal of this model would spread rapidly. If he failed, the collapse would reinforce arguments that isolation breeds instability. Either outcome carried strategic consequences far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. And beneath every reaction, supportive or fearful, lay the same unanswered question. Could a state fighting for survival afford to worry about long-term dependence, or was survival itself the only currency that mattered now? As Burkina Faso's security strategy hardened, the pressure shifted from the battlefield into everyday civilian life. Prolonged mobilization reshaped society in ways that were impossible to ignore. Emergency measures became routine. Movement restrictions expanded. Civil liberties were narrowed under the logic that survival required discipline. For many citizens, especially in urban centers like Ouagadougou, the line between temporary necessity and permanent control began to blur. Political opposition weakened, not necessarily through mass arrests, but through exhaustion and fear of destabilizing a fragile state further. Media outlets adjusted tone. Civil society organizations scaled back activity. The government framed these changes as unavoidable trade-offs in a nation under siege. Critics warned that once power concentrates under the banner of emergency, it rarely disperses on its own. In rural regions, the impact was more tangible. Communities already strained by displacement now faced land uncertainty as barter agreements with foreign partners entered public discussion. Farmers questioned whether land offered today in exchange for weapons would ever return to local hands tomorrow. The promise of security competed directly with the fear of long-term loss. Migration pressures intensified as families weighed the risks of staying against the uncertainty of leaving. Some moved south toward relatively stable regions. Others crossed borders, adding strain to neighboring states already grappling with insecurity. These movements did not happen in isolation. They altered labor markets, increased food scarcity in some areas, and placed additional pressure on weak administrative systems. Politically, the state's legitimacy narrowed to a single metric: security outcomes. As long as insurgent attacks declined, the government's approach retained support. If violence surged, tolerance for emergency governance would erode rapidly. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Military success justified political tightening. Military setbacks intensified calls for stronger control. Over time, this dynamic risked hollowing out institutions meant to survive beyond any single leader. Regionally, the consequences were just as serious. Burkina Faso's trajectory reinforced a pattern already emerging across the Sahel. Governments under pressure were prioritizing immediate security over long-term institutional reform, turning toward partners willing to deliver results without conditions. This approach produced short-term stabilization in some areas, but weakened regional coordination. Trust between neighboring states frayed as alliances diverged. Intelligence sharing became selective. Border management suffered. The Sahel's instability, once compartmentalized, threatened to become systemic. For external observers, particularly in the United States, these developments carried implications that extended beyond Africa. Fragile states under sustained pressure tend to export instability through migration, transnational crime, and the expansion of extremist networks. When governance becomes militarized, the space for negotiated solutions narrows. When resource deals are struck under duress, grievances compound rather than resolve. Burkina Faso's internal strain was no longer just a domestic issue. It was a warning signal. The country stood at a crossroads where each decision reduced future flexibility. Accepting external support without conditions preserved immediate sovereignty, but risked embedding long-term dependencies that future governments would struggle to unwind. Rejecting that support risked military collapse and state fragmentation. For ordinary citizens, none of these choices felt like real choices at all. They were consequences imposed by circumstances beyond their control. As pressure mounted across society, one reality became clear. Burkina Faso was no longer simply responding to a crisis. It was being reshaped by it. And the longer the emergency persisted, the more permanent those changes threatened to become. From Washington's perspective, what is unfolding in Burkina Faso presents a dilemma with no clean answers. The United States has spent decades promoting a security model built on partnerships, conditional assistance, and institutional reform. But in the Sahel, that model is colliding with a reality shaped by coups, insurgencies, and growing distrust of Western intentions. American policymakers are acutely aware that overt pressure on Ibrahim Traoré's government could accelerate the very outcome they fear: a full strategic break from Western systems. Yet restraint carries its own risks. If the United States appears passive while sanctioned states embed themselves militarily and economically in West Africa, the credibility of American influence erodes quietly but decisively. Allies face similar constraints. France has already lost its military footprint and struggles to articulate a path back into the region without reigniting resentment. The European Union retains economic tools, but lacks the flexibility to compete with partners who offer security assistance without political conditions. Meanwhile, Russia, China, and North Korea operate under fewer domestic constraints and longer strategic timelines. They are willing to accept instability as long as influence grows. For American strategic planners, the concern is not Burkina Faso alone, its precedent. If a resource-rich but militarily vulnerable state can sustain itself through barter agreements, parallel supply chains, and non-Western security partnerships, the leverage traditionally exercised through sanctions, aid conditionality, and diplomatic isolation weakens across the board. This has implications far beyond Africa. It affects how power is projected, how norms are enforced, and how future conflicts are managed. Older Americans who lived through the Cold War and the construction of the post-World War II order may recognize the pattern. Systems rarely collapse all at once. They erode at the margins, through exceptions that become examples, and examples that become alternatives. Burkina Faso now sits uncomfortably close to that line. For the United States, the question is not whether to reassert influence through force or withdrawal. It is whether existing strategies are still capable of shaping outcomes in a world where other powers are offering different rules entirely. And if they are not, what replaces them before the vacuum becomes permanent? What happens next in Burkina Faso will not be decided by a single deal or a single leader. It will be shaped by whether this experiment in survival hardens into a model others follow. If Ibrahim Traoré manages to hold territory, suppress insurgent momentum, and keep supply lines open through Eastern partnerships, the message will be unmistakable. A nation can bypass Western systems, trade resources for security, and endure without the approval of institutions built after World War II. That lesson would not remain in Africa. It would travel quickly to other fragile states watching from the margins, calculating their own exits. But there is another path, and it is just as consequential. If Burkina Faso's reliance on external actors deepens into long-term dependence, if land concessions become permanent footholds, if emergency governance becomes the norm rather than the exception, the cost of survival may quietly exceed its benefit. Sovereignty preserved in name can erode in practice. And history shows that arrangements made under pressure rarely unwind cleanly. The most dangerous outcome may not be collapse or success, but stagnation. A state locked into perpetual emergency, supplied from abroad, unable to reform because reform itself becomes a liability. For Americans who remember the Cold War, this moment should feel familiar. Competing systems do not announce themselves with declarations. They emerge through necessity, exception by exception, until one day the rules no longer apply as they once did. Burkina Faso has become one of those exceptions, a small country carrying a question far larger than its borders. If the Sahel continues to fragment over the next year, if alliances harden along parallel supply networks, and if Western responses remain hesitant, the shift now underway could accelerate beyond reversal. The future being tested, there is not about ideology. It is about whether order is maintained through shared rules or replaced by transactional survival. As you reflect on this story, consider what kind of world endures when stability depends not on trust, but on leverage, not on institutions, but on necessity. The answer to that question will shape not only Africa's path forward, but the security environment your children and grandchildren inherit. And that is why what is happening in Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré deserves more than passing attention. It deserves careful thought, sober judgment, and an honest reckoning with how global order actually survives.